Yeah, a lot of people know about when they know about the American Revolution, especially around here. Everybody's familiar with Patriots' Day and the Battle of Lexington and Concord. But a lot of people aren't familiar with the fact that Massachusetts has been involved in revolutions before that. I guess it's something of a local tradition. So as Laura mentioned, there's the plaque and the signage on Appleton Street for Appleton's Pulpit, and that's all tied into the first revolution in Saugus that happened. Would that be about almost 100 years before 1775 in the American Revolution? So I'm hoping people will find this a little bit interesting, going back a little earlier than that. One of the things when I do historical presentations, one of the problems I have is figuring out when to start, because I look at history as being a bunch of connections. So event A was caused by event B, which was caused by event C, which was caused by event D, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and you can just keep walking back through these causes. And so it's always a little tough for me to just decide where I want to start, how far back I want to go. So what I'm going to do is give you a little bit of background on what was going on to lead up to the revolution that Appleton's Pulpit is actually associated with. So let's find that. So I decided to go back as far as the early 1500s, because a lot of the background of what was going on in Massachusetts was caused by events that were going on almost 200 years before that. So this is Martin Luther. Martin Luther is notorious for basically starting the Protestant Reformation. So in the late Middle Ages, the Catholic Church in Europe was a very powerful organization, controlled a lot of the things that were going on. The Bishop of Rome, who we call the Pope, their philosophy was that they were basically the ultimate authority in Western Europe at that point in time. That secular leaders like kings and things like that really should be following what the church was advocating. So Protestant Reformation starts in the early 1500s, and almost immediately there are religious wars. So there are people who are followers of the Catholic Church, supporters of the Catholic Church. There are people who are supporters of Martin Luther and some of these other people involved in the Protestant Reformation, and they start fighting with each other, arguing with each other. And some people used that as an excuse for supporting other things that they wanted to do. And so one of the people that you may have heard of is Henry VIII. He was the King of England at the beginning of the 1500s, and he decided he wanted a divorce from his wife. He's sort of notorious now for the fact that he actually went through 6 wives. But the first one that he wanted to divorce, the Catholic Church did not basically sanction divorce at that point in time. Their doctrine was that God actually joined you in marriage, and you didn't have the right to unjoin yourself. So what they used to do was, in the case of powerful people like kings and things like that, is they sort of took an end run around it, and they did what we call annulments of marriages, which is the Roman Catholic Church would say that you hadn't actually been married for some reason. That something was wrong with the arrangement you had made, And so the marriage wasn't actually legal as far as the church was concerned, and you could annul the marriage, and you didn't cause the doctrinal problems that a divorce would. And so he comes along, wants to get out of one of his marriages, and he gets into a dispute with the Pope about this. The Pope won't give him an annulment, and he decides to take England out of the influence of the Catholic Church. And in 1529 to 1536, he convinces Parliament in England to pass a bunch of laws separating the Church of England from the Roman Catholic Church. And this leads to various religious disputes in England at that point in time, and things sort of seesaw back and forth. So his son dies young and never has any children. His daughter becomes Queen of England, and she dies without any children. And his other daughter, Elizabeth, also never marries, and so she dies without children. So the line of the descendants of Henry VIII basically disappears, and the crown, the English crown, actually goes to a distant relative of his, who is the King of Scotland, and that's King James there, and that's why they call him James the First and Sixth, because he's the first King James of England, but he's the sixth King James of Scotland. So the Scottish king becomes the King of England in the late 1500s, and he is a Protestant, and he continues keeping the Church of England separate from the Roman Catholic Church. His son is Charles I, and Charles I is the King of England who charters the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The first charter for Massachusetts is issued in 1629, and King Charles does something which to this day we still have no real explanation for. He grants Massachusetts Bay Colony the only royal colonial charter that allows the colony to be self-governing. So the Massachusetts Bay Colony is the third English colony in North America at that point in time. Virginia is the first English colony in New England. Plymouth, which on the South Shore, was the second colony. It used to be separate from Massachusetts. And Massachusetts Bay is the third English colony. And he grants Massachusetts a charter that allows them to be self-governing. And the net effect of this is that it attracts these religious dissenters we call Puritans. So at this point in time, since the time of Henry VIII, there has been a national church in England called the Church of England. You are required by law to belong to the Church of England. You are required by law to pay taxes to the Church of England. The Puritans think that the Church of England is corrupt. This is their opportunity to bail, and they come swarming over here in the 1630s. We call it the Great Migration. 18 to 20,000 Puritans settle on the coast of Massachusetts. And that's the beginning of independent government in Massachusetts. So Massachusetts is organized by people who basically don't want to associate with the Church of England, but they are Protestants, they're not Catholics. But there's also still Catholic supporters in England, and they go back and forth. And because the King of England is also descended from Scottish kings, they get involved in religious disputes that go on in Scotland at that point in time, too. So this is actual copy of the charter from 1629 for the Massachusetts Bay. Now, in the 1640s, these disagreements in England break out in civil war. And one of the things, oh, I forgot to mention, one of the other things about Charles the First is he gets into a series of debates or disputes with the legislature in England at that time, which is called Parliament, basically about money. You know, the kings of England are always having trouble getting Parliament to give them the money that they want, the amount of money that they want. And there are frequent disputes about that sort of thing. But by the early 1640s, the disputes have gotten so serious that civil war breaks out. And supporters of Parliament form one side of the dispute, and the supporters of King Charles are the other side of it. And from 1642, there's actually some minor outbreaks of violence earlier than this, but in 1642 to 1651, there are a series of wars between an army formed by Parliament and the King of England. And a gentleman named Oliver Cromwell comes along and is a very successful general during the English Civil War, and eventually the forces of Parliament win out against the forces of Charles I. And not only do they defeat his army, they actually try him for treason and execute him. And so in 1649, they behead the King of England, and they don't replace him. They abolish the monarchy in England in 1649, and they establish a commonwealth that lasts from 1649 to 1653. So there is no king in England for this period of time. This happens to coincide with the establishment of the ironworks in Saugus by coincidence. The Saugus Ironworks is in production during the Civil War in England. And this is actually one of the things that drives a lot of the activities in the colony are the background of the Civil War going on in England. So, for example, in the 1630s, at the beginning of the colony, people are migrating, Puritans are coming here in fairly large numbers. But when the Civil War breaks out, people stop coming to the colonies. They stop being interested in what's going on in the colonies because they're all involved in what's going on back in England. So there's an economic collapse in the colony that's actually caused by the Civil War in England, because people aren't, not only are people not immigrating to the colony, they're not able to trade to produce goods and trade with the mother country. This sort of dominates everything that's going on. But Oliver Cromwell is elected protector during the Commonwealth period. So he effectively becomes a military dictator during that period. And by the end, when he dies, people have decided that they're kind of tired of being run by a dictatorship, and they want to revert to some of the older things that they're familiar with, like the monarchy. So in 1660, Parliament invites the son of Charles I, who becomes Charles II, to regain the throne of England, and this takes place in 1660, and they call it the restoration of the monarchy. Now, Charles II is not a supporter of the Catholics in England. He's a Protestant too, but there are several factions in England which are trying to bring back the alignment of England with the Catholic Church, and so there's a lot of disputes around that. And he dies in 1685, and one of the things that's going on in England between his restoration in 1660 and his death in 1685 is there are factions in the English government who are not sympathetic to Puritans. They've gotten pretty tired of Puritans by this point in time, and they convinced the English government to revoke the Massachusetts Charter. So the charter that was issued in 1629 gets revoked in 1684, the year before Charles II passes away. And this is obviously devastating to the people in Massachusetts, because they've been very proud of the way they've organized their government relative to the way things are done in Europe. So this is actually a period in European history where there are a lot of rulers who are advocating the absolute authority of the kings. This is a period of obviously expansion of colonies. Lots of Western European kings are establishing colonies all over the place. But it's also a period where people kings are advocating that they have absolute total authority over their subjects. And England is unique in that they had that period where they didn't have a king. And so people like Louis XIV in France, are claiming that they have absolute authority. Charles II does not go that far, but he does think that they should be ratcheting back a little bit on Puritan influence in the government. And then in 1675, a massive war breaks out in the colony. We call it King Philip's War. It was led by a Wampanoag sachem named Metacomet, and his English name was Philip. And this is the bloodiest war that has ever occurred in New England. If you measure by what percentage of the population was killed in this war, this is the bloodiest. The estimates are that about 25% of the population of New England was killed in this war. And that's 25% of the colonists, and it's 25% of the natives in the area. This was basically an accidental fight between the native population and the English settlers. They were trying to wipe each other out, and it occurred throughout New England. There were fights in Connecticut and Rhode Island and Massachusetts and Maine, and women and children were not spared. Both sides were trying to exterminate each other. And basically, it starts in 1675, and you can argue about when it actually ends, because the fighting continues for decades afterwards around the periphery. Most of the native fighters in this area were driven out of southern New England, but they continue to skirmish on the borders of New York and Maine for decades after this. And this actually continues into about the 1740s. So you've got religious disputes going on in the colonies at that point in time, and you've got fighting going on. For example, I'm trying to remember the exact date. It's in the 1670s, 1680s. There's an attack on Billerica, for example. Indian warriors are coming down from the western Abenaki in Maine and from from upstate New York, and they're getting as far south as Billerica and the areas right around here. Saugus didn't actually see any attacks during King Philip's War, but this was widespread, and things had been pretty peaceful up until that point in time. There had been one war with the Native Americans in 1636 down in Connecticut, but up until 1675 things had been pretty quiet, and then they really broke loose. So so this is sort of the background that's going on with the behind the political disputes that are going on about the government in Massachusetts. You've got wars going on. You've got religious disputes going on. This is Thomas Savage, Major Thomas Savage. He was actually the last owner of the Saugus Iron Works. The Saugus Iron Works was established in 1646, and it ran as an iron works until about 1670, and it was not a particularly successful business in terms of making money. One of the big mysteries about the Saugus Iron Works is that they never really made a profit. There were a few times that they broke even, but they were never really financially successful. It was an enormous operation. The land in Saugus that became the Saugus Iron Works was originally a 600-acre farm. There was a gentleman named Thomas Dexter who owned a 600-acre farm in what was Lynn at the time. It was it was considered West Lynn. And Thomas Dexter sold his 600-acre farm to the investors in the ironworks. They built the ironworks. They ran it for a number of years, but they kept running into problems. And the biggest problem that they had was they kept getting behind on payments for raw materials. The ironworks used an enormous amount of raw material. The blast furnace there, for example, burned 36 cords of wood a day. So that meant when that blast furnace was at full blast, they had to clear cut an acre of forest a day just to feed the blast furnace. The iron ore, they needed enormous amounts of iron ore. They needed a bunch of other supplies and things like that. And they were buying raw materials from people around, farmers and settlers in the area. So people would chop trees down and they'd sell the wood to the ironworks. They would dig iron ore and they'd sell the iron ore to the ironworks. And they would frequently get behind in paying for this, and they were constantly being sued by their creditors. And Thomas Savage got together with a gentleman named William Payne, and they formed a consortium and they sued the ironworks. And the court awarded the property to the creditors. And Thomas Savage and William Payne got together and they went around and they bought up all the awards to the creditors. So there were a whole bunch of people, farmers and things like that in the area who had sold raw material to the ironworks, and then had been awarded ownership of part of the ironworks in repayment for their default on their raw materials. And Savage and Payne bought up all these liabilities from these people. So at the end, they were the two owners of the 600 acres and all the operation. Now, this is actually a good time to sort of talk about the Appletons and why the Appletons were in Saugus to start with. The Appletons were actually a very wealthy farmer merchant family from Ipswich. If you go up Route 1A through Hamilton, when you cross the line into Ipswich, on the left-hand side of the road is the Appleton Farm. It's the oldest continuously operating farm in North America. It's been there since 1636. It's 1,000 acres. At the early parts of the colony, a lot of the influential people in the colony actually lived in Ipswich. So, for example, the son of the governor lived in Ipswich. The Appletons lived in Ipswich. But one of the daughters of William Payne married Samuel Appleton, Sr. And when William Payne passed away, in his will, he left his grandchildren a bequest of 1,500 pounds. And they were supposed to receive their bequest when they reached their 21st birthday. And so Samuel Appleton, Jr., reaches his 21st birthday, and his grandfather's estate does not have 1,500 pounds in cash. But they've got this property in Saugus that had been an ironworks. Now, at this point in time, the ironworks was out of business. By the 1670s, it had gone bankrupt for the last time and gone out of business, and it had reverted to being a farm. It was called the Ironworks Farm because everybody knew that there had been an ironworks there, but it was a 600-acre farm. And Samuel Appleton Jr. Says, well, you know, my grandfather has left me this bequest, but there's not cash in the estate, but there's this farm, and he demands his share of the farm, and he goes through a series of suits with Thomas Savage to claim his inheritance, and they go back and forth and back and forth, and finally Thomas Savage buys out, sells out to Samuel Appleton. They arrange a settlement, and Samuel Appleton Jr. acquires the 600 acres. He's got the part that was bequeathed to him by his grandfather, and he's got the part that he's bought off of Thomas Savage. So now he owns 600 acres in Saugus, and he builds the house that's at the ironworks in the 1680s. So the house that's there now was not there when it was an ironworks. It was built as a farmhouse after it reverted to being a farm in the 1670s, 1680s. And so Samuel Appleton Jr. Is living in that house. And that coincides with King Charles II revoking the charter in Massachusetts Bay in 1684. The Appleton Jr. is living at the farm. And one of the things about the revocation of the charter is that the authority of towns to give land to settlers is based on that charter. So the Massachusetts is a little unusual in the way the land was divided up. In most of the English colonies, like Virginia, for example, Virginia is a chartered corporation. And so if you want to go to Virginia, you give money to the Virginia company, and they authorize you to acquire a certain amount of land. So you say, I want a 300-acre farm. And you give the Virginia company the money for it, and they say, okay, you can have a 300-acre farm. And the way it worked in Virginia was you then went to Virginia with your letters patent for your land, and you looked around to find 300 acres that wasn't already claimed by somebody. And so what people in Virginia tended to do is they would wander around until they could find the best land. And they'd find a certain piece of land that was good land for farming and wasn't already claimed by somebody, and they would claim title to it. They would be given title to it. Massachusetts wanted people to form towns. The Puritans had a different view of the way the government should be arranged. So under their charter from 1629, what they would do is you would get a group of people together who wanted to settle a town. They called them proprietors. And you'd get a group of proprietors, and you would go to the Massachusetts General Court, and you'd say, you know, we want to establish a town. So instead of going as an individual to establish a farm, you would go as a group to establish a town, and you'd be given a town. You'd be given land to establish a town, and then the proprietors would divide up the land. And so this is why the towns are sort of laid out the way they are in Massachusetts, because the grant from the General Court would specify that you had to have a meeting house, and that people had to build their homes within a certain distance of the meeting house. And you had time limits. You had a certain amount of time, 2 or 3 years usually, to establish your town. So what the people would do is they would be given this grant of land, a specific grant of land. They would go there. They'd decide where they wanted to put their meeting house. They would build their homes around the meeting house, but then they would get to decide who got what land within that grant. And so the usual thing was that you had a small plot of land near the meeting house where your home was, but you would also have pieces of land that had been granted, that were divided up by the proprietors around the town. So you didn't necessarily have contiguous property. So they would say, you get a wood lot of 20 acres, and you get some meadow of 100 acres, and you get some marsh of 30 acres and stuff like that. So Massachusetts spread in terms of towns instead of individual farmers. It was very different from the way other English colonies worked. But when the charter was revoked, it basically revoked the authority of the General Court to grant land to people. And so everybody's panicked that they're going to lose their farms and everything. So James II is Charles II's brother, and he becomes king in 1685. So right at the year after they revoked the charter in Massachusetts, Charles II dies, and his brother takes over the throne. But the problem with James II, from their viewpoint, is he's a Roman Catholic. He's the last Roman Catholic king of England, and so there's a lot of concern in England about what it's going to mean for the Church of England if the king, who's the head of the Church of England, is a Roman Catholic. And they've revoked the charter in 1684, but they haven't replaced it with a new charter. So everybody's sort of, well, what do we do for a government? We're afraid we're going to lose our land grants. We don't have magistrates. We don't have judges. We don't have elected officials and things like that. So they sort of keep rolling on the old organization for 2 years until 1686. And then they decide that they can't wait any longer for the English government to figure out what's going on. And they hold a regular election like they'd been holding under the Charter of 1629. And they elect a governor, and they elect the legislature for Massachusetts Bay Colony. Because they say, well, it's been 2 years and we've got no word from England on what we should do. So we'll just keep doing what we've been doing. And they elect Simon Bradstreet governor in May 12th of 1686 because they haven't heard anything from England about what they should do. And in May 15th, which is only 3 days later, a royal commission shows up and says, we're in charge. So the English government creates this organization called the Council of New England, and they appoint Joseph Dudley to be the president of the Council of New England, and so he and his counselors are supposed to run the colony. And now another thing that's going on here, so it's the whole election is 3 days later. This guy shows up and says, I'm in charge now. So they've got the Council of New England started only 3 days after they hold these elections. And then in England, they decide that I'm sorry, there's something else I want to mention. It's the Council of New England. It's not the Council of Massachusetts. Because another thing that the English government decides they want to do at this period in time is they want to consolidate colonies. So they merge Massachusetts with Rhode Island and Connecticut, and create basically the Dominion of New England instead of just being separate Massachusetts. But then they decide that they're going to actually appoint a royal governor and create this Dominion of New England. And he arrives in December of 1686. So they go for 2 years without a charter. Then they decide that they're just going to elect a governor and a legislature. And 3 days later, that goes out the window. And then by December of 1686, the English crown changes the organization of New England. So they basically had 3 separate governments in Massachusetts in, a 7-month, 8-month period. And they appoint this gentleman, Edmund Andros, to be the governor general of this new dominion of New England. He had been the royal governor of New York prior to this. So people may know that New York was originally a Dutch colony. It was originally New Amsterdam. And England fought a series of wars with the Dutch in the mid 1600s. And one of the outcomes of these wars with the Dutch is that they acquire the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam. They change the name to New York. They appoint Edmund Andros the governor of New York. And then when they're reorganizing New England in 1686, they appoint Edmund Andros the new governor of New England. So he shows up in 1686, and one of the first things he actually does is he starts a war with the French. The French are in what's northern Maine now, Acadia, it was called, and he gets involved in wars with the Abenaki and the French in the north of the colony. And this is what I was sort of saying about King Philip's War, is this sort of fighting just continues on the northern frontier for decades. But the other thing is he's got money problems. He needs to finance this new government, and he starts levying taxes on the colonists. And the reaction of the colonists who've been used to electing their own governors and things like that is that, who's this guy to come along and tell us we have to give him money? And the net result of that is that the Appletons, Samuel Appleton Sr., refuses to pay the new taxes that are established in the spring of 1687. And he starts agitating against the government of Sir Edmund Andros. And that's where Appleton's Pulpit comes in, is that the Edmund Andros basically executes a warrant for the arrest of Samuel Appleton for not paying the taxes, and for agitating against the new government. And this is in September of 1687. The people resisting the new taxes hold a rally at this site in Saugus, and Appleton gives a speech denouncing the governor and and insisting that he won't pay the taxes. So they arrest him, and this is the plaque that was that's on the place where he gave that speech. So he's arrested September 20th, 1687, and he's imprisoned until March of 1688. But something else is going on in England, which is James II is a Catholic, and there are Protestant factions in England at that time which don't think it's appropriate for the monarchy to be headed up by a Roman Catholic, and they start a revolution, which is usually referred to in English history as the Glorious Revolution. They convince James II's daughter, Mary, that's Mary on the right there. She's married to a Dutch prince named William of Orange. And they convince William of Orange and Mary to invade England with a Dutch army and depose James II. So at the same time that Samuel Appleton's in prison here in Boston, there's a revolution going on in England, and a Dutch army lands in England in November of 1688, and convinces Parliament to pass the monarchy to William and Mary as joint monarchs. So this is where you get, you may have heard of the College of William and Mary. It's named for these monarchs. So they were joint monarchs, and so this happens late in 1688. And one of the things that's kind of a problem for people back then is it takes a long time to get here from England. If you sail here from England, it can take you a month. It can take you depending on the weather, it can take you 2 months. So it takes a while for news to travel between England and the colonies too. So the revolution occurs in England in 1688. William and Mary take control of the monarchy, but people in the colonies don't really find out about this until early in 1689, and they seize on this opportunity to get rid of Edmund Andros. So April 18th, 1689, a rebellion breaks out in Boston, and Andros and the other members of the council are thrown in jail. And this actually occurs in some of the other English colonies at the same time. People take advantage in the colonies of the revolution going on in England. And so there's an uprising in Maryland and in New York at the same time. And a group of Bostonians get together and they establish the Council for the Safety of the People and the Conservation of the Peace. And they take over the government. And it's kind of interesting that, April 19th is Patriots Day. April 18th is the date on this. So this is a broadside that is printed on the right-hand side. It's a broadside that was printed in Boston in 1689, announcing the Council of Safety taking over the government. But then they have to figure out what they're going to do next. They've taken over they've taken the government away from Edmund Andros, the royal governor, and so they hold a series of conventions in May, and they go back and forth about what to do, and they eventually decide. There's lots of people arguing for various approaches to how to establish the government. And what they effectively do is they simply allow the 1686 office holders, the governor and the legislators that were elected in 1686, to resume their offices. So they just kind of reset to what was going on prior to all this. And so but they still realize that they don't have a charter from England, and there are people disputing how they should organize their government, and they realize that they've got to get support from England to figure out what to do, and Massachusetts sends Increase Mathers to London to be the agent to represent Massachusetts to the Crown and to Parliament, and he's in London from 1688 to 1691, and his big task is negotiating the creation of a new charter for Massachusetts. So the government in England is not willing to allow Massachusetts to revert to the 1629 way of doing business, but there are arguments about what they should do instead, and he's sort of the person driving this from the viewpoint of Massachusetts. So he realizes that they're not going to let them go back to having an independent government like they've had in 1629, where they elect their own governor and stuff. They're going to have a royal governor. The monarchy is not going to allow them to elect their own governor. There's going to be royal appointees and things like that. But they try to Increase Mathers tries to get the best deal he can get out of England at that point in time. And they get a letter from King William saying, obviously people report to England that they've arrested the governor, Edmund Andros, and they've set up their own government and stuff. But they managed to get a letter from King William saying, we understand that what's going on in Massachusetts, that you're unhappy with Edmund Andros and the government there, and we also understand that we don't have a charter for you, and we've got our plate full with our own revolution going on in England and stuff. So we're not going to be able to deal with this immediately, but just keep on doing what you're doing. And it's kind of funny, they actually get a letter from the King of England saying, you're cool, we'll get back to you. And finally, they issue a new charter in 1691, and they appoint William Phipps as the first royal governor. And he's a friend. He's actually from Maine, but he's a friend of Increase Mathers, and so that's one of Mathers' successes, is he convinces the King of England to put one of his friends in as the first royal governor, and he leaves Plymouth, England, with the new charter, the Great Seal, and Increase Mathers on March 29th, 1691, and arrives in Boston on May 14th and sworn in as the new governor in May 16th. And that's the charter that exists until the American Revolution, and they come up with their own constitutions. So it's sort of flip-flopping back and forth. It's the 1680s are an interesting time because of all these changes in government going on at that time. And this is also one of the things that's people may be familiar with what's going on in Salem in the spring of 1691, 1690. That I made a mistake on the date there. That shouldn't be March 29th, 1691. It should be March 29th, 1692. The charter is issued in 1691. It takes them a little while to get it over here. So it's the spring of 1692. And there's something going on in Salem in the spring of 1692 that he stumbles into the middle of, which is the witch hysteria. So one of the interesting things is that you've got warfare going on the northern frontier. You've got a new charter showing up and a new governor showing up, and at the same and they've what's the term? There are no magistrates, there are no judges at that point in time, because they're planning on Phipps is planning on appointing new justices and new magistrates and establishing the courts and things like that. And the witch hysteria breaks out at the same time. And so there's so basically when they're dealing with the witch hysteria, they're making it all up as they're going along. And that's why they create the Court of Oyer and Terminer, which is Phipps says, we've got to deal with this witch hysteria. We don't have time to wait for all the organs of government to be established. So he creates the Court of Oyer and Terminer to deal with that problem while he's fixing everything else. And it's a tough time for the colony, and there are people. One of the things that's kind of an interesting aspect of this is the Puritan attitude towards some of this stuff. Puritans believe in providentialism. They believe that God takes an active role in people's daily lives, and that when things start going wrong for the colony, that's because God's mad at them. And so when they have these Indian wars and they have these changes in government and things like that, the Puritan attitude is this is a direct result of God punishing them for their sins. And it's a tough time for Massachusetts. So any questions?
One situation, the officials that became the majority of the legislature took what? All voters were only men that owned property.
Yeah.
Nobody else could vote. And nobody else therefore could ever get a job.
Well, it was even one step farther, because of the Puritans' attitude towards this was it was only men who owned property who were elected members of their churches.
Yep.
And that was something that changed over time too, because There were English settlers here before Massachusetts, before the Charter of 1629. There were the Dorchester Adventurers, for example, in Namkeg. You know, Roger Conant and his people. There were the Pilgrims down on the South Shore and stuff. And so when they established the government in 1629. They used the term free man. Free man was a person who was allowed to vote in the government, and they grandfathered the people who were here already, but all the new immigrants going forward, you had to be elected into a church, you know, and that was one of the big debates between the people who were followers of the Church of England and the Puritans, was the business of how you became a member of a church. In the Church of England, you became a member because you were required by law to be a member. All English subjects, had to be members of the Church of England. That was, you had to pay taxes to the Church of England. You had to belong to the Church of England. And the Puritans had, this is one of their disputes with the Church of England, is the Puritans believed that you had to be elected into a church. You had to have demonstrated that you were the elected of God, and they didn't believe in the hierarchical structure of the Church of England. Church of England, you had parish priests, and then you had bishops above them, and then you had archbishops, and there was a hierarchical structure, and the Puritans were Congregationalists in that regard. They didn't believe that the church should be run by an authority from somewhere else.
Another thing early on was that there was a very lack of women. My wife's family goes all the way back down to the South Shore, where he married an Indian woman, because that was the only woman available.
If there are additional questions, we maybe should take them in the food room.
I have one question.
Sure.
When there was a war in England, was that the War of Roses?
No, the War of the Roses is 200 years before this. So basically, Henry VIII's father, Henry VII, was the winner of the War of the Roses. So the last battle of the War of the Roses is in 1485.
I thought that was very good.
Yeah.
And you didn't have any notes at all.
Well, thank you.